Hello and welcome back to Historical Context. Today we're continuing our 16th century explorers unit by talking about a man named John de Verrazzano. John de Verrazzano, or as I'll refer to him as Verrazzano, was born in 1485 in Florence, which is now a part of Italy. Little is known about Verrazzano's life, but we do know that he actually moved to France in a town called Dieppe in 1506. And in 1508, Verrazzano explored Newfoundland on a fishing expedition. He actually explored the coastline, which was just one decade after John Cabot's voyage. And if you want to know more about that, you could go back to the episode a couple of weeks ago in which we talk about John Cabot. In the early 1520s, the King of France, who was King Francis I, was beginning to face pressure from his merchants about finding a new trade route to the Far East. And this is a familiar theme for us as we've seen other monarchs, both in Spain and briefly in England, wanting to find a new, more efficient trade route to the Far East. So the monarch, Francis I, asked Verrazzano to explore the area between Florida and Newfoundland and look for a new trade route that would make its way to the Far East. So at that time, clearly it was not known that there was a solid mass of land there. There was a hope that it was just several islands and that there would be an area that Verrazzano could penetrate through and get to the Far East. Verrazzano's first attempt involved 4 ships. It was a quick failure as 2 of the ships were lost and 2 were damaged in a storm, and those 2 damaged ships that survived had to turn back to the French coast. So on January 17th, 1524, Verrazzano tried again. He left France and headed westward for the New World. We're lucky today as our readings come directly from Verrazzano, who wrote his own account. He wrote it in Italian, and it was later translated to English. 5 weeks after they left on February 24th, they ran into a storm. Let's have a look. On the 24th of February, we encountered as violent a hurricane as any ship ever weathered, from which we escaped unhurt by the divine assistance and goodness, to the praise of the glorious and fortunate name of our good ship that had been able to support the violent tossing of waves. I think it's interesting here that the term hurricane gets thrown around. Clearly that wasn't a hurricane considering that it was February in the mid-Atlantic, but it was probably a pretty bad storm, something along the lines of what you would see in the wintertime as a nor'easter on the east coast of the United States. Verrazzano continued for another 24 days, and right around March 20th, they finally discover land. Let's have a look. At first it appeared very low, but on approaching it to within 1/4 of a league from the shore, we perceived by the great fires near the coast that it was inhabited. We perceived that it stretched to the south and coasted along in that direction in search of some port in which we might come to anchor. So they're heading south to try to find a port to anchor in. Where Verrazzano has arrived is the east coast of modern-day North Carolina. And it's interesting that they figure out things are inhabited not because they see natives, but because they see smoke burning from different fires, and that's from different native encampments. So they head south, and they cannot find anywhere to come ashore. So they go back north, and they're still having difficulty, and finally they find an area to send a boat ashore. And when they do this, they come in contact with some natives. Let's have a look. Many people who were seen coming to the seaside fled at our approach, but occasionally stopping, they looked back upon us with astonishment, and some were at length induced by various friendly signs to come to us. They then showed us by signs where we could more conveniently secure our boat and offered us some of their provisions. So coming in contact with these North Carolina natives is off on the right foot with Verrazzano and his crew. There's more observations. They go entirely naked, except that about the loins they wear skins of small animals, like martens, fastened by a girdle of plaited grass, to which they tie all round the body the tails of other animals hanging down to the knees. All other parts of the body and the head are naked. Some wear garlands similar to birds' feathers. They are not very strong in body, but acute in mind, active and swift of foot. In these last two particulars, they resemble the people of the East, especially those the most remote. So I think there he's talking about islanders from the Far East, and it's an interesting description. Unfortunately, Verrazzano could not make any other observations as they quickly left where they were at. They were just kind of looking around, and they go further north, and they make another stop with additional observations. The whole shore is covered with fine sand, about 15 feet thick, rising in the form of little hills about 50 paces broad. An outstretched country appears at a little distance, rising somewhat above the sandy shore, in beautiful fields and broad plains, covered with immense forests of trees. It abounds also in animals, as deer, stags, hares, and with a great variety of birds of every kind. So the landscape being sandy is a new observation for Europeans. I think they weren't used to the amount of sand that existed on the East Coast. And for those of you who were wondering, yes, it is a natural phenomenon. Some people don't believe that. They leave and head further up the coast, and they begin to notice that there's a large number of inhabitants. In fact, they say, and I quote, "The inhabitants being numerous, and we saw everywhere a multitude of fires." So the natives were burning fires at different encampments all along the East Coast. They come ashore at another spot, and the natives there they're signing back and forth, and they seem friendly, and the natives signal where Verrazzano and his crew could come ashore. And then something fascinating happens. Let's take a look. "One of their noble deeds of friendship deserves to be known to your majesty. A young sailor was attempting to swim ashore through the surf to carry them some knickknacks. When he came near 3 or 4 of them, he tossed the things to them and turned about to get back to the boat. But he was thrown over by the waves and so dashed by them that he lay as it were dead upon the beach. When these people saw him in this situation, they ran and took him by the head, legs, and arms and carried him to a distance from the surf. They laid him at the foot of a little hill, when they took off his shirt and trousers and examined him, expressing the greatest astonishment at the whiteness of his skin. Our sailors in the boat, seeing a great fire made up, and their champion placed very near it, full of fear, imagined that the natives were about to roast him for food." Whoa! But as soon as he recovered his strength, after a short stay with them, showing by signs that he wished to return aboard, they hugged him with great affection and accompanied him to the shore. So clearly the natives of this area are very friendly towards the Europeans, and I think it's extremely fascinating to see. This is 80 plus years prior to Jamestown. Very little is known about these individuals from either side, quite frankly, and to see that show of support in saving that young man's life, albeit at a scare to the Europeans, is certainly refreshing. Verrazzano continues up the eastern seaboard heading north, and he makes another stop and goes ashore. This time the natives flee out of fear, but they find an old woman, a boy, a girl, and 2 infants hiding in the bushes. Here's what happened. We gave them a part of our provisions, which they accepted with delight, but the girl would not touch any, everything we offered her being thrown to the ground with anger. We took the little boy from the old woman to carry with us to France, and would have taken the girl also, who was very beautiful and very tall, but it was impossible because of the loud shrieks she uttered as we attempted to lead her away. So it seems as if the boy was more willing to go with them, therefore they took him to take him to France, and the girl didn't want anything to do with them, so they let her go. They go back onto the ship, so, a lot of Verrazzano's mission here is landing, looking around, and going back out, and he continues north and ends up in modern-day Newport, Rhode Island. So he is now in New England. Let's have a look at his observations. We found the country on its banks well peopled, the inhabitants not different from the others, being dressed out with the feathers of birds of various colors. They came towards us with evident delight, raising loud shouts of admiration and showing us where we could mostly securely land with our boat. We passed up this river about half a league when we found it formed a most beautiful lake 3 leagues in circuit, upon which there were rowing 30 or more of their small boats from one shore to the other, filled with multitudes who came to see us. I find it very interesting at this point, if you're noticing from the readings, a consistent theme of natives pointing to where people can secure their boat. And, I don't know if that's a symbol of possible trade occurring between natives going by canoe through that area, but clearly they have some knowledge of the area and where it is safe to secure a ship and where it's not safe. And so I just kind of found that piece of it very interesting. And unfortunately, you got all these people coming around, and it's a great opportunity to make observations and to learn about the culture. But a storm comes and it forces Verrazzano out of the area. And they're going to continue along the coastline. And now, if you're familiar with the New England coastline, it now jets east. And so they start going east along the New England coastline, and they come to another stop, and they encounter a tribe of natives who are a little more timid than some of the others that they've come across, and they have to be coaxed to kind of come closer. The tribe has 2 chiefs that Verrazzano refers to as kings. Their attire consists of deer skins, and they wore large chains with stones on those chains around their necks. They stayed with these natives for 15 days, and they even had the king and his queen, one of the chiefs and his wife, aboard the ship for a meal. Verrazzano talks at length about these natives, having spent 15 days with them, and about the land that he's at as a whole. He observes that the land is full of oaks, cypress, and other trees unknown to Europe. He describes apples, plums, filberts. He adds that the natives use sharp stones to cut down trees, and that one long log is hollowed out to make a boat, or a canoe as we know it, that could fit 10 to 12 people in it. Logs are split into halves to make houses, and the roofs of those houses are made of straw. Some of these native houses can hold between 25 and 30 people. So on May 5th, they leave this area, and they're heading now into what is modern-day Massachusetts. and they're shadowing the coast as they go, and they come upon another tribe. But with this tribe, the observations are a little different. Let's have a look. The people were entirely different from the others we had seen, whom we had found kind and gentle. But these were so rude and barbarous that we were unable by any signs we could make to hold communication with them. They clothed themselves in the skins of bears, lynxes, seals, and other animals. No regard was paid to our courtesies. When we had nothing left to exchange with them, the men at our departure made the most brutal signs of disdain and contempt possible. I think it's interesting that these people were apparently a little more rude, a little more abrasive, and this is a similar part of the country where the Plymouth Pilgrims would land at a later date. So we'll have to keep, as we go further down the chronology, we'll have to keep our eye on this and see if these natives are the same as the ones the Plymouth Pilgrims ran into. So aside from Verrazzano receiving New England hospitality, he comes upon several islands that to him resemble islands off of modern-day Croatia. And as he's making these observations, it's noted that supplies are running a little low and that it's time to start heading back to France. Verrazzano makes a conclusion in regards to the natives in the region, and we'll have a look at it. Our conclusion was that they have no religious belief whatever, but they live in this respect entirely free, all which proceeds from ignorance, as they are very easy to be persuaded, and imitated us with earnestness and fervor in all which they saw us do as Christians in our acts of worship. Does that sound familiar to anyone? And I'll tell you what, instead of telling you where it's at, why don't you comment in the comments section of the podcast? So Verrazzano returns to France, and he actually finishes this writing on July 8th, 1524. Verrazzano's legacy in this journey is that he was the first European to lay eyes on Manhattan, Massachusetts, and a majority of the East Coast, specifically points North Carolina to Massachusetts. Verrazzano's discovery of Manhattan in his writings was extremely insignificant. In fact, I think he covered it for just a couple of words, but obviously it would turn out to be a significant place for the new American nation later on. Verrazzano would go on to have an undocumented voyage to Brazil in 1527, and on his third voyage in 1528, Verrazzano was actually killed. So Verrazzano's story ends with great disappointment, and unfortunately he never found, obviously as we know from geography, that trade route to the Far East. But this does not stop more explorers from coming, and more explorers from looking, and more explorers from entering native communities. So now our next story, starting next week, is going to talk about a man who spent 8 years walking the lower 48 and Mexico. We're going to start that journey next week on Historical Context.